Modern Pokemon games have been controversial, to say the least. Fan opinions began to splinter when the series made the jump to the third dimension, with some being put off by what they deemed as an unacceptable level of animation quality and overall performance from the developers of one of the largest multimedia franchises of all time. With each release, fan grumbles began to pile up until the release of Scarlet and Violet in late 2022 caused a dam to break, and the overall sentiment of gamers on the internet seemed to unify under the banner that the new games were completely unacceptable and Game Freak were a bunch of incompetent hacks that were just putting out yearly slop because they knew that gamers would buy it no matter what as long as there was a Pikachu on the back. This, of course, meant that the stage was set for any of the numerous monster-catching games out there to make a grab at Nintendo's crown and dethrone the world's largest contender in the genre. And if the Steam numbers, official statements from Nintendo, and bad faith memes are anything to go off of, then a game that found itself at the center of even more controversies than Pokemon may well be the one to make itself at least impossible to ignore. I, of course, speak of Palworld. From the initial release of its reveal trailer, Palworld was immediately a source of very heated discussion, looking for all the world to be a game that was selling itself on the simple concept of, what if Pokemon, but also gun? Opinions seemed to be split between those who called it a shameless cash grab and those who felt that it was so ridiculous that they had to try it out for morbid curiosity alone, myself being in the latter camp. But regardless of your opinion on it, it's hard to argue that Palworld didn't choose about as perfect a time to release as they could. And now that the game has actually been out for a few weeks and my wife and I have had time to sink our teeth into it over on her Twitch channel, which you should go watch, I have some thoughts. It's no secret to anyone that watched my last video that I am a fan of Pokemon. I have been since Generation 1, and I still love the modern games just as much, if not more. Don't worry, we'll circle around to that in a bit. As I mentioned before, the first impression that most gamers will get when clapping eyes on Palworld for the first time is that it's just Pokemon with guns. However, it does become clear once you get into the game that it's not so much Pokemon with guns as it is Arc with Pokemon. From the get-go, the player finds himself washed up on an island with nothing but the clothes on their back and finds themselves tasked with building a base, collecting creatures, and gathering the supplies necessary to survive. This is where the game shines, with an absolutely addictive primary, secondary, and tertiary gameplay loop. On a moment-to-moment basis, you'll be collecting pals or gathering resources as part of the primary loop. As you gather more materials and level up, you'll unlock the ability to craft tools that will help you catch stronger pals, gear that will allow you to use your pals as mounts or even as weapons, and facilities that you can put your pals to work in, all as part of the secondary loop. And as you do all of that, you're also becoming more and more capable of traversing the map easier and running dungeons and fighting bosses, all as part of the tertiary gameplay loop. However, that's about as much of a discussion on the mechanics of Palworld as we really need to go into, because this video isn't meant to be a review of Palworld as much time in script writing as that would have saved me, especially since the one I'm reading from now is the second draft of one that initially basically was a review. But hey, you should have known better than to come to a channel with a name like mine and expect there to be any sort of point to all this. If you wanted to know whether I think it's a soulless ripoff of Pokemon but with guns added in, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think it's less of a Power Rangers and tattooed teenage alien fighters from Beverly Hills situation, so much as it is a Pokemon and Digimon situation. Though Palworld doesn't have Beelstarmon, so what's the point? Instead, I want to talk about some things that have been on my mind as a result of spending so much time either playing Palworld or thinking about what I'm going to be doing the next time we're playing Palworld live at twitch.tv/PirateKairik. Go follow now. Before we get there though, we gotta do my favorite thing and go on a tangent so we can lay some groundwork. As I've mentioned before, I am a fan of Pokemon and I've played every single generation at least once, many of them multiple times. I also love long-form video content as it makes for a great background noise while I'm trying to get things done. So suffice to say, I have seen a lot of think pieces on the franchise and consider myself to at least have my finger on the pulse of what the fans feel the series is like. And frankly, it don't look good, Chief. You see, one of my favorite pieces of Pokemon content and long-form video content in general to come out recently has been Shugul's 11-hour epic and exhaustive look at Pokemon Brilliant Diamond, the follow-up to their previous 7-hour masterwork and exhaustive look at Pokemon Omega Ruby. I recently watched them back-to-back because I have nothing better to do with my life. And some of the points made across both videos keep coming back to haunt the corners of my mind as I play through Palworld. And before I even begin this section, let me reiterate, I love these videos. I think Shugul's is a brilliant filmmaker and storyteller, and this isn't even meant to be some sort of criticism or hackneyed response so much as it is the result of shotgunning 2 television seasons worth of content about Pokemon while thinking about Archimon like I'm the dude in the distracted boyfriend meme. Frankly, I don't even recall what I'm going to harp on being that major of a point in his videos, and there's definitely some channels I won't name who are a lot less even-handed in their criticisms, but this is the thing that wheedled its way into my psyche like a copy of Parasite that the internet decided to sneak into my deck before the duel started. And the argument that I'm referring to is the idea that modern Pokemon games are bogged down by their stories. I would say that at least half the discussion I see from people who talk about the issues with modern Pokemon games that don't involve optimization comes from the idea that the games interrupt the player with too much story. Whether that be supposedly relentless tutorialization, players getting interrupted on their quests by NPCs or story beats, or just getting sidetracked by things that take them away from their adventure. Generation 8 being one of the most commonly cited offenders amongst disgruntled gamers for this specifically. Most often paired with this criticism is the kind of rose-tinted nostalgic waxing about Gens 1 and 2 that you would probably expect to hear from my 90s baby ass, if you'll forgive the brief straw man. Oh, back in the day we didn't have these overcomplicated plots and all we needed was the story of us and our party as we took on the gyms, defeated Team Rocket, and beat our rival to become champion. Yeah, buddy, I was there. I made those same stories for myself. They were boring. Take away my true 90s kid card if you really want to, but like, as much as I love those games, and make no mistake, I do still love them, they're not exactly Blood Meridian, and that whole emergent storytelling thing is kind of another way of saying the games didn't really have much of a plot at all. Now, before I get the Gen 1ers up my ass for the millionth time in my life, yes, these games do include moments of story up to and including the Pokemon Tower and Silphco and the story running in the background of Giovanni and Team Rocket. However, you'll forgive me if I say that these elements do not a story make, and that Generation 1's plot hardly constructs a satisfying narrative. You see, for that, you need actual characters. Which brings me to the reason why I think modern Pokemon games are by and large better than the originals, if for no other reason than storytelling. You see, the problem is, the characters of the first two generations aren't really characters. This is Blue, your rival character from Generation 1. When I talk about Blue in this video, I am not referring to any material outside of Pokemon Red and Blue version on the Game Boy. Blue's characteristics are that he is a hyper-competitive brat that wants to be the champion of the Pokemon League. Why? Because the plot demanded a rival character. He's basically Bakugo from Season 1, but unlike Bakugo, he never really undergoes any character growth. What does Blue do in the course of the story of Generation 1? He occasionally shows up to beat up your Pokemon and talk about how much better of a trainer he is. When you beat the Elite Four and are about to be crowned champion, you learn that Blue has already beat you to the punch, and now you have to beat him to restore karmic balance to the land of Kanto. In the 90s, this was fine, but I would argue that there's no real narrative satisfaction to be found here anymore, and that any modern gamer would be less than impressed at the story of these games. But then again, there's plenty of nostalgia-blinded man-children out there who will still tell you that Ocarina of Time is unironically a 10 out of 10 experience that totally holds up, so what the hell do I know? What I'm saying is that Blue is a one-dimensional character. One of the strengths that people often cite about the simplicity of Generation 1's story is that your motivation is simple. Blue is a dick, so you want to become the best trainer in the land so that he can't be. And when you find out that he's champion TR'd you, it's meant to give you an opportunity for a cathartic final revenge for all the shit he's talked throughout the experience. However, since Blue is barely a character at all, the experience is about as fulfilling as beating the shit out of a cardboard cutout of Kim Jong-un. For contrast, let's take a brief look at a character from one of the most oft-maligned modern games in the series, Pokemon Sword and Shield. Now, I will cede to you that the main story of the Generation 8 games is pretty weak, but if I'm going to do that, I need you to be willing to listen to me when I tell you that the stories involving the actual characters of Generation 8 involve some of the strongest writing in the franchise, and for that, we need look no further than the rival character, Bede. When we first meet him, Bede is certainly that exact same dick-headed Blue/Gary Oak archetype where he feels that not only is he superior to you, but his superior skills as a trainer justify him looking down on everyone else and treating them with open hostility. But why is Bede this way? Well, as it turns out, Bede was an orphan who was personally sponsored to take on the Pokemon League by the chairman Rose, who is also the man who gave Bede his first Pokemon. Now, it comes as no surprise to anyone playing the game that Rose is actually manipulating the boy and using him to further his own goals, but as a result of this tremendous debt that Bede feels to Rose, he's completely blind to the manipulation that's going on, and Bede also feels this almost insurmountable pressure to perform that drives his decisions about as much as his own ambitions do. to. As a result, Bede is standoffish, callous, and haughty in his interactions with the player character and Hop, your companion. This all comes to a head when Bede ends up destroying a priceless historical artifact because he believes doing so is the best way to aid Chairman Rose. This, of course, blows up in his face when Rose ends up having to save face and disqualifying Bede from the League Challenge as a result. Bede has now lost the support of the one person in the world whose opinion he really cared about. He's left with nobody. He's devastated. We see the hurting, lonely child that lied beneath this cold outer shell the entire time. Bede is left to figure out what to do with his life now that his ambitions have been shattered, and that's when he's found by a familiar face, Opal, the fairy-type gym leader that the player would have already defeated at this point. Opal looks at Bede and sees something in him, some sort of potential. She offers to train him to succeed her as the fairy-type gym leader, and doesn't give him the option to refuse. Bede has lost his purpose, but has now gained something infinitely more valuable. The next time we see Bede is during the finals of the Pokemon League, where he, as the newly appointed gym leader, interrupts the tournament to demand a rematch with the player. But there's now something different about him. He has a kinder look to his eyes. His time with Opal has shown him what it's like to truly connect with someone who cares about you. And now that he's undergone this growth, he's willing to see the player not as an obstacle, but as a fellow trainer and human being. Bede isn't fighting you to establish dominance or just because he's a dick. He's fighting you as a dialogue from one person to another, like all of the best fights in media are. And as a result, you get this incredible pathos out of the reunion. Maybe it's just me, but if the price I have to pay for that kind of emotional storytelling is having these characters constantly appearing throughout my journey to give me updates on their own, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. It's what makes Pokemon Sword and Shield a story with real characters and not just some magic pet fighting simulator. And none of that even touches on the story of Hop, a kid who lives his entire life in the shadow of his successful older brother's accomplishments, and whose journey to define himself as a person means that I will hear no slander of him on this channel. And hell, if we had another hour or two, I could talk your ear off about how I got so emotionally invested in the story and characters of Pokemon Scarlet that I legitimately teared up during the ending and the final confrontation with the Professor Sada AI. If you're gonna deny the emotional power of the stories told in these more modern Pokemon games because you hate having to read, then I don't know what to tell you other than Master Duel is free. I'm sure that more than a few of you are asking at this point, what the hell any of this has to do with Palworld? Well, let me put it like this. I am thoroughly enjoying my experience playing through Palworld. I've mentioned before that it has completely satisfying and addicting gameplay loops, and the multiplayer functionality is a lot of fun, but the complete lack of actual characters that give context to an almost non-existent story, it keeps making me think that this is probably as close to the platonic ideal of a Pokemon game as can be achieved in the eyes of people who complain about the storytelling in modern Pokemon games. A big toy box where you can just run around and catch monsters without being interrupted by somebody trying to give context or reason to why you're doing that. And maybe that's me, but like, I think that sucks. Whatever you take away from this video, don't let it be that I'm down on Palworld in any way. It's a fun game that I plan to keep playing for the foreseeable future. Come watch us whenever we're live at twitch.tv/PirateKairat. This was more just a way for me to give form to some thoughts that kept running through my head while I was playing Palworld. And after all, if this was the wrong channel to come to if you're expecting me to have a point. But for now, I think this is where we're going to go ahead and part ways. So before you leave my channel, why don't you go check out my last video that I made on Pokemon Concierge if you enjoyed this one. And just remember that this has been a powerfully pointless video, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. Okay, 2 videos in a row kind of talking about Pokemon. No, don't worry, I am not going to be a Pokemon channel. I don't even look like a GameCube game. Hey, that's the kind of high-quality jokes you can expect to hear on Powerfully Pointless. But, you know, there were originally a couple of ideas that I wanted to talk about for this video, and Palworld just, again, it kept coming up over and over in my mind when I was brainstorming. And the first draft of this video actually ended up being closer to just sort of a review of Palworld. And for a channel that puts out a video every 2 weeks, I think trying to become a reviewer is not the smartest idea. So I took this point that was originally something that was a bit of a smaller focus in the original draft and decided to expand on it. Uh, I thought it was very interesting, and I certainly wasn't expecting by the end of this video to become a major bead stan, but boy howdy am I love modern Pokemon games, and it fucking breaks my heart every time I hear people say, oh, there's too much talking in modern Pokemon games. Like, and I mentioned those videos from Shugels, which you should 100% watch because they are incredible masterpieces. Uh, but it did irk me that I think in some very small way, he pointed out, like, obviously modern Pokemon games do have longer tutorials, I say in quotes, just as a result of the way the story is integrated with things. And me personally, I love it. I love Sun and Moon, I love Sword and Shield, and I've loved Scarlet and Violet, and I cannot wait to see what comes out next if this high standard of storytelling keeps up. But I'm not. I don't know if I'm really in the majority there. So I'm curious to know what people think. Go ahead and leave a comment letting me know what you think of modern Pokemon games versus classic ones. And I guess that's more or less everything I wanted to talk about. So thank you as always for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.